On a night when the Colorado mountains swallowed sound and mercy alike, Miles Harris, a former Navy SEAL with a heart sealed shut by loss, opened his cabin door and found 3 German Shepherd puppies freezing on his porch. He knew the rules. Don't interfere. But their tiny breaths were a silent prayer, and he couldn't ignore it. He carried them into the firelight, and that's when the real miracle began. In the dark, their mother came to his door, not snarling, not begging, just staring like she was placing her last hope in a stranger. If you believe God can use the smallest lives to deliver the biggest miracles, stay with this story. Colorado's high country wore the blizzard like armor, and Miles Harris's cabin sat alone in it, a small, stubborn lantern of wood and smoke, surrounded by white silence and pine shadows. Miles was the kind of man the world expected to be unbreakable. Late 30s, lean muscle packed tight from years of training, shoulders squared as if the air itself might attack, close-cropped dark hair, and a jaw cut sharp enough to look like it had opinions. A pale scar threaded along his right knuckle where a ring once might have been, and his eyes, a storm gray, carried the tired focus of someone who still listened for danger, even in peace. People in the nearest town said he left the Navy because his contract ended. Miles let them have that story because it was clean. The truth had teeth. He left because a name kept returning like a wave that refused to recede. Ethan Price, a teammate who didn't make it home. Since then, Miles lived like a man paying a debt to silence, keeping his days simple, his words few, and his heart locked behind the same disciplined calm that once helped him survive. That calm cracked tonight when a sound slipped through the wind, thin and raw, not quite a bark, not quite a cry, more like a plea that hadn't learned language yet. He sat up in his chair, boots already on out of habit, body moving before permission arrived. The cabin smelled of pine resin and old coffee. The wood stove glowed like a patient ember god. Another whimper, closer, and Miles's throat tightened with an old, unwelcome memory. A cold night, ocean spray, Ethan's breath turning to fog under red lights, and the split second where fate chose a different ending. Miles opened the front door, and the storm tried to shove its fist into the room. Snow flew sideways. On the porch, huddled in a miserable knot, were 3 German Shepherd puppies, maybe 6 or 7 weeks old, small enough to fit inside the crook of his arm, big enough to have already learned that the world could be cruel. The first, Daisy, had a soft black and tan coat crusted with ice, a tiny white smudge on her chest like someone had dabbed her with hope, and round glassy eyes that tracked Miles with exhausted trust. She trembled so hard her whole body looked like a leaf trying to hold on. The second, Max, was all stubborn spirit trapped in a freezing body, his ears half-flopped, muzzle dusted with snow, lips pulling back in what was supposed to be a warning, but came out as a breathy squeak. Even half dead, he still tried to be brave, like a pocket-sized soldier. The third, Teddy, was the smallest. His tan markings faded as if winter had started erasing him first, paws tucked under, eyes half-closed, too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes a man's brain start counting losses. Miles froze in the doorway, not from cold, but from the old argument that lived inside him. The wilderness had rules. Do not touch the young, or you might doom them, or invite a mother's rage, or both. Miles had rules too, carved into him by years of being told that leaving someone behind was the only unforgivable sin. He swallowed, tasting iron, and for a heartbeat he was back in the water with Ethan again, hearing the snap of commands, feeling the weight of seconds. "Not tonight," he muttered, voice rough, as if talking to the storm or to guilt itself. He scooped Daisy first, her ribs fluttering under his palm like a moth trapped in a jar. Max tried to resist, then surrendered with a pathetic little wheeze that made Miles's chest pinch. Teddy was last, light as a bundle of wet leaves, and Miles hated how weightless he felt, hated how familiar that helplessness was. Inside, he kicked the door shut, and the cabin became a sanctuary by inches, warmth pushing back the dark. He wrapped them in clean towels, one after another, and set them close to the stove, but not too close, careful in the way only people with hard-earned training are careful. His hands, scarred and steady, moved with a medic's precision he'd learned in places where mistakes collected bodies. He rubbed their paws, their ears, their bellies, coaxing blood to remember its job. He spoke softly, not baby talk, not lies, just a calm rhythm meant to keep panic from blooming. "Breathe," he told them, as if they understood English, as if he could negotiate with the universe. The puppies responded in their own grammar. Daisy's tiny sigh, Max's trembling huff, Teddy's faint rise and fall that Miles watched like it was a fuse burning down. Minutes crawled. The storm rattled the windows like an impatient ghost. Miles counted breaths the way he once counted heartbeats under gunfire. 1, 2, 3, anchoring himself to something he could control. Somewhere in the middle of the night, Daisy's tongue brushed his finger, warm and shockingly alive, and Miles felt something inside him loosen, something that had been clenched for years. Max, still offended by weakness, burrowed against Miles's wrist as if claiming him, and Miles almost laughed, a small sound that surprised him because it had edges of tenderness. "Yeah, all right," he whispered. "You're tough." But Teddy stayed frighteningly still, and Miles sat closer, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed, as though staring hard enough could drag the little pup back from wherever cold souls drift. Dawn bled slowly into the sky, turning the snow outside a pale blue, and for the first time, Miles let himself believe 2 of the 3 might make it. That's when he heard it, a soft, deliberate scratching at the back door, not frantic, not random, measured like a code tap. Miles's spine went rigid. He stood, breath caught, and listened again. Another scrape. Then a heavy exhale from the other side, low and steady, definitely not human, and far too close to ignore. Night fell hard, as if someone had slammed a lid on the mountains, and the snow kept piling against the cabin like the world was trying to bury a secret. Miles moved through the dim room with the quiet economy of a man trained to survive in hostile places. No wasted steps, no unnecessary noise. He lowered the lamp near the window until it was only a bruise of light, then stood behind the curtain with one shoulder angled to the wall, a posture that belonged to old instincts rather than comfort. The puppies were in the side room near the stove, wrapped and breathing, their small sounds now less like dying and more like dreaming. Miles told himself to feel relief, but relief was a luxury his body didn't trust. The scratch at the back door came again, patient and deliberate, not a frantic clawing, more like a knock made by something that understood rules. Miles didn't reach for a weapon first. He reached for stillness. He listened, eyes half-lidded, tracking the cadence of the wind, the creak of timber, the faint shift of snow off the roof. Another scrape. Then a low exhale, steady and close, carrying the scent of wet fur and cold earth. He opened the back door a few inches, and the storm shoved icy air into the kitchen, sharp enough to sting his lungs. Outside stood a full-grown German Shepherd, female, likely 2 or 3 years old, but life had thinned her down. Her coat was the classic black saddle over tan legs, though snow had turned it mottled and gray. Her ribs pressed against her skin like the bars of a cage. One ear stood upright, the other tipped slightly, as if it had once been folded by a hard hand or a hard fall. Her muzzle was dusted white, and her eyes were amber-brown, bright and unsettlingly focused, not the wild panic of a stray, but the contained fear of a mother choosing between bad options. She didn't lunge. She didn't bark. She held her body low, weight balanced, ready to retreat or defend, yet her gaze kept flicking past Miles into the warm breath of the cabin. Miles understood that look. It was the same look he'd seen in men who had no more time, only decisions. He stepped back and eased the door open wider, hands visible, palms empty, letting his body speak the oldest language of peace. The dog hesitated, nose working, reading him the way dogs read truth better than people do. Then she crossed the threshold slowly, paws silent on the wood, moving as if she'd walked into a cathedral built for strangers. Miles shut the door behind her with care, not wanting the latch to snap like a gunshot. He kept distance, feet planted, ready to break the moment if it turned wrong. But the dog didn't look at him again. She walked straight toward the side room, drawn by sound and scent like a compass needle finding north. When she reached the puppies, the room changed. Daisy lifted her head first, a tiny wobble of excitement. Max made a squeaky, offended grunt like he was mad at the universe for keeping her away. Teddy's chest rose, then rose again a little stronger, as if her presence was medicine. The mother lowered herself with a shudder and began to lick them, not just cleaning, but counting them, checking each ear, each paw, nudging their bodies into better positions against the warmth. Her tongue worked fast, frantic with purpose, and when she pressed her side against them, it looked like she was trying to pour what little strength she had left into 3 small vessels. Miles watched from the doorway, throat tight, feeling something almost humiliating in his chest. He had faced gunfire without shaking, yet this quiet reunion made him feel unarmed. He'd been taught to see animals as variables, threats, hazards, unknowns. But here was a mother making a bargain with a man she had every reason to fear. The dog finally glanced up at him, and Miles saw it clearly. She wasn't asking for affection. She was asking for permission to keep breathing. The storm hammered the windows. The cabin became an island with one law: survive together or not at all. Miles moved to the kitchen and cut thin slices of jerky, softened them in warm water, and placed the dish near the doorway of the side room so he wouldn't invade her space. He set a bowl of water beside it and backed away. The mother approached cautiously, body still low, eyes never leaving Miles's face, testing for traps, betrayal, sudden motion. Miles stayed still, hands loose at his sides, letting his heartbeat slow on purpose. He remembered Ethan again, not the death, but the lesson. Control the room by controlling yourself. She ate quickly, then returned to the puppies, curling around them in a protective crescent. The heat from the stove made her fur steam faintly, like a living thing thawing back into the world. Hours passed in a careful choreography. Miles tended the fire, replaced towels, checked the puppies' breathing without touching more than necessary. The mother tolerated his presence as one tolerates weather, unavoidable, watched, endured. Yet there were moments when her eyes softened, not into trust, but into something like recognition, as if she understood that this man's stillness wasn't predatory, it was practiced restraint. Near midnight, Daisy crawled over Max and pressed her nose into the mother's chest, making a sound like a tiny engine. Max, too proud to cuddle openly, leaned his back into her ribs and pretended it was accidental. Teddy whimpered once, and the mother's head snapped down immediately, her tongue soothing his face with frantic devotion. Miles felt the old part of him, the part that had gone numb on purpose, begin to wake up and ache. He didn't want to care. Caring was the doorway grief walked through. But the cabin smelled of warm fur and wood smoke, and for the first time in years, Miles didn't feel like he was only surviving. He was protecting. Sometime before dawn, the mother rose and padded to the bedroom corner where Miles kept a spare blanket. She didn't steal it. She looked at it, then looked at him, then returned to her pups, as if making a silent request. Miles slid the blanket across the floor with his boot, slow and non-threatening. She took it gently in her mouth and pulled it into the nest. The motion was so domestic, so heartbreakingly normal, that Miles had to look away for a second. When he looked back, her eyes were on him again, and in them he saw not gratitude, not obedience, but a truce carved out of desperation. Morning light finally seeped through the storm clouds, thin and gray. Miles stepped onto the front porch to check the drift, and that's when he saw it. Footprints. Not just paw prints scattered by chance, but human boot tracks circling the cabin, looping around windows, pausing near the woodpile, as if someone had been studying the place like a puzzle. Miles crouched, fingers hovering above the impressions without touching, reading them the way he once read sand for mines. The tread pattern was deep and aggressive, made by someone who walked with weight and purpose. A chill moved through him that had nothing to do with weather. He turned his head slowly toward the tree line, scanning the white distance. The storm had hidden many things, but it hadn't erased them all. The storm refused to leave, as if winter had planted a flag in the mountains and dared anyone to argue. By the second day, the cabin's warmth felt less like comfort and more like a fragile treaty. The power blinked in stubborn, sickly pulses, the light bulb stuttering like a nervous eyelid, and Miles Harris began measuring time the way he once measured supplies overseas, by what was left. His pantry had been built for a lone man who didn't expect visitors, emotional or otherwise. Now there were 4 extra mouths, and one of them, the mother shepherd, carried hunger in her whole silhouette, the kind that sharpens the face and hollows the ribs until love itself looks like a skeleton. Miles ate less without announcing it, the way proud people do. He thinned his coffee until it was brown water, drank it anyway, and pretended the bitterness was enough. The puppies were stronger now, their bodies finally remembering how to hold heat. Daisy tottered after him when he moved from room to room, her paws too big for her balance, her eyes soft with a loyalty that seemed to have arrived early. Max had turned his stubbornness into a personality, nipping the air when Miles adjusted his blanket as if to say, "I'm not helpless, I'm just small." Teddy stayed quieter than the other 2, his head heavy, his breaths sometimes shallow enough that Miles caught himself counting them again, like prayer beads. The mother remained mostly silent, watchful, her presence changing the air of the cabin. She wasn't domesticated exactly, but she wasn't feral either. She carried herself like a dog that had once known commands and consequences, and now lived in the anxious space between. Miles tried not to stare at her flank, where the fur looked rubbed thin, as if a collar had chafed there for a long time. He had seen that mark on working dogs before. He knew what it could mean. When the wind eased slightly, Miles pulled on his coat and stepped outside to chop more wood. The cold slapped him awake. He worked with controlled force, axe rising and falling, breath steaming, shoulders moving in a rhythm that usually emptied his mind. Today it didn't. Bootprints still lingered in places the drifting snow hadn't erased, looping near the windows, pausing by the woodpile. Someone had been close. Someone had circled the cabin the way predators circle a wounded animal. Miles scanned the tree line, then moved to the fence where the wind piled snow in uneven waves. That's when he found it snagged on a splintered post. A strip of leather, torn and stiff with ice, the buckle twisted, the whole thing half buried like a relic. He pulled it free and turned it in his gloved hands. A metal tag swung from it, scratched and dulled, but the letters were still there under the grime. K9 Unit. Miles's stomach tightened. These weren't puppies born to roam wild valleys. They had once belonged to people who used uniforms and radios and leashes. People who should have known better than to abandon 3 pups in a blizzard. He brought the collar inside and set it on the table. The mother shepherd saw it immediately. Her head lowered, her ears pinned back in a way that wasn't fear of Miles, but fear of memory. She didn't approach. She stared at it as if it might bite. Miles spoke softly, not to soothe her like a pet, but to honor the fact that she understood tone, even if she didn't understand words. "Okay," he murmured. "We don't have to talk about it." He put the collar in a drawer, but the knowledge stayed out in the room with them. That evening, the storm deepened again. The windows rattled. The forest beyond the cabin turned into a black wall. Miles sat by the stove cleaning a small flashlight, checking batteries, doing the kind of pointless maintenance that kept his hands busy when his mind wanted to spiral. The mother lay curled around the pups. Daisy's head rested on her paw. Max slept with his muzzle pressed into her fur as if he'd finally surrendered to needing her. Teddy's body rose and fell in faint, uneven waves. Miles watched him too long. The quiet inside the cabin was broken by a sound that didn't belong to weather. Metal on metal. A faint clink, then another. And underneath it, something worse. Low voices, laughter held back, the hushed cadence of people who didn't want to be heard. Miles went still. His SEAL training didn't return like a dramatic movie scene. It returned like muscle memory, unromantic and immediate. He killed the lamp, moved to the window, and raised his binoculars. In the distance near the creek, between the dark pines, small points of light bobbed. Headlamps. 3 of them. He saw shapes bending, hands working close to the ground. Then a brief gleam, like a chain. Traps. One of the men, tall and broad-shouldered, wore a hood pulled tight, face hidden, movements confident, practiced. Another was shorter, restless, turning his head too often, jittery energy that suggested impatience or paranoia. The third moved with lazy assurance, the kind of man who thinks the world is his to take. He lifted a bottle to his mouth and then tipped a different bottle downward, pouring something dark onto a chunk of bait. Even from this distance, Miles felt his skin crawl. Poison had a smell in the mind. The mother shepherd's head snapped up. A low growl vibrated in her chest, the first sound of anger Miles had heard from her, and it wasn't aimed at him. It was aimed at the woods, at those lights, at whatever memory lived there. Her eyes narrowed, and Miles realized she recognized them, or recognized what they represented. The cabin suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a witness box. Miles's throat tightened around an old vow he'd made after Ethan died. No more running toward trouble. No more believing he could outpace consequence. He'd come here to be quiet, to shrink his life down to something he could control. But outside, someone was laying cruelty into the snow like a map. Miles looked toward the side room where Daisy stirred, where Max's ears twitched, where Teddy lay too still. He didn't want to be a hero. Heroes got people killed. He only wanted to not be the man who turned away. He pulled a notebook from the shelf and began sketching a rough layout of the creek, the trees, the distance, the angles from the cabin, the way the headlamps moved. Evidence, not impulse. Then Teddy made a sound that snapped Miles's attention like a rope pulled tight, a thin, strangled whine. The puppy's body jerked once, then again, small spasms that looked wrong in the firelight. His belly tightened, muscles quivering. Daisy startled awake, whining in confusion. Max scrambled up, teeth bared at nothing, instinctively protective. The mother rose fast, nose to Teddy, licking his face in frantic strokes. Miles was already on the floor, hands on Teddy's sides, feeling heat that hadn't been there before. Fever. Sudden and climbing. Teddy's eyes rolled slightly, unfocused, and his paws paddled the air as if he was trying to run away from pain. Miles's mind flipped through possibilities like a field medic sorting triage: infection, hypothermia rebound, ingestion. The collar in the drawer flashed in his thoughts like a warning sign. Canine unit, poison by the creek, boot prints circling the cabin, a chain of dots that suddenly formed a shape. Miles reached for his emergency kit and felt his stomach drop. The antibiotic blister pack was empty. The anti-seizure meds he once kept had expired and been tossed months ago. Outside, the men's lights moved through the trees like slow-moving fireflies, indifferent to the lives shivering in his cabin. Inside, Teddy convulsed again, and Miles pressed his forehead briefly to the pup's neck, as if trying to transfer willpower through skin. He forced his voice steady, the same voice he used on panicked men. "Stay with me, Teddy," he whispered. "Just stay." But the storm roared, the power flickered, and in that fragile, burning slice of night, Miles understood the awful math. If he couldn't get medicine soon, the smallest of the three would not see morning. The cabin turned into an infirmary with no ceiling but storm. Miles Harris worked on Teddy with the blunt tenderness of field medicine, the kind that doesn't pretend miracles are gentle. He cooled the puppy's paws with a damp cloth, warmed his chest with steady heat, and measured sips of sugar water into a tiny mouth that didn't want to swallow. Teddy's fever came in waves, surging and retreating, and each tremor felt like a clock hand ticking towards something Miles refused to name. Daisy paced in nervous loops, her little nails tapping wood like anxious Morse code. Max planted himself at Teddy's side, ears stiff, growling softly at the air as if he could intimidate illness into leaving. The mother shepherd hovered above them like a shadow that had learned how to pray, her muzzle nudging Teddy, her eyes flicking to Miles whenever the pup's body tightened. Miles checked his supplies with a rising dread: gauze, tape, antiseptic, a few painkillers, no antibiotics. The last bottle had been used the previous summer after a rusty nail found his palm. He'd meant to restock. He'd meant a lot of things. The storm outside didn't care about intentions. Miles stood in the kitchen with the emergency kit open like a confession, and the name Ethan Price pushed forward in his mind again, not as a ghost, but as a lesson. You don't get to choose the moment you're needed. You only choose whether you show up. The old ranger station sat a few miles downslope, abandoned years ago when funding dried up and the state decided the mountains could fend for themselves. Miles had passed it once while hiking, a sagging building with a radio tower like a broken spine. If there was any chance of leftover supplies or a working emergency radio, it would be there. The decision tasted like risk, and risk tasted like war. He moved quickly, layering clothes, stuffing a small pack with a flashlight, rope, and what little food remained. He poured warm water into a thermos, more for courage than thirst. In the side room, the mother shepherd rose the instant she sensed his intent. She stepped between him and the door, body angled, head low, not aggressive but firm, like a barricade made of muscle and fear. Up close, Miles noticed the raw patch at her neck again, and beneath it, faint shaved fur, as if someone had once clipped her for equipment. Her amber eyes held a wordless message: leaving is how things disappear. Miles's chest tightened with a familiar bitterness. He hated promises because promises were what he'd offered Ethan once, half joking, half serious, before everything went wrong. "I've got you." He'd believed it then. He'd learned the universe didn't always respect belief. Still, Miles crouched, lowering himself to her level, showing his hands. "I'm coming back," he said quietly, voice rough but steady. "I swear." The mother didn't blink. Daisy whimpered. Max gave a small, defiant bark that sounded like a child trying to sound grown. Teddy's body shuddered, and the mother's nose pressed to his ribs as if she could hold him here by force. Miles swallowed hard. He wasn't asking permission. He was asking them to trust him with a second chance. He stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a slap from a god that didn't believe in mercy. Snow blurred the world into a white tunnel. Miles moved with careful precision, using trees as markers, counting steps, keeping his body low against the wind. Every so often, he looked back at the cabin, the only dark shape in the white, and felt a pang that startled him. He hadn't expected to care this fast. The path down was treacherous, and the mountain hid its traps under a powdery kindness. Miles reached a slope where the snow looked smooth, almost inviting. His boot found ice beneath it, a thin sheet that held just long enough to lure him into wait. Then it betrayed him. His foot slid sideways. His arms shot out. For a fraction of a second, he floated, weightless, like a man stepping off a helicopter into nothing. Then he fell. His ankle slammed into rock with a crack that sounded too clean, too final. Pain exploded up his leg, white-hot and immediate, stripping away breath and pride. Miles tried to stand out of pure refusal. The ankle folded. He went down again, teeth clenched so hard his jaw screamed. The storm swallowed his grunt. He dragged himself toward a tree, leaving a dark smear where his glove tore through snow to find purchase. His breath came sharp, shallow, and the cold moved in like a patient enemy. He reached for his phone and saw the same dead truth as before. No signal, no help, no easy out. The sky dimmed faster than it should have, clouds bruising into dusk. Miles pressed his back against bark, forced his breathing into a rhythm. In SEAL training, they taught him the body could endure more than the mind believed. Tonight, the mind was the weak link. He pictured Teddy's small body convulsing. He pictured the mother shepherd blocking the door. He pictured Ethan's face, younger than Miles remembered, smiling right before the world split. "Not like this," Miles whispered, as if the mountain could negotiate. His eyelids grew heavy, and he fought to keep them open, slapping his cheek once, then again, because sleep in cold wasn't rest, it was surrender. A crunch sounded nearby, distinct from the wind, deliberate, close. Miles forced his eyes open. A shape emerged between snow-laden pines, low to the ground, moving with purpose. The mother shepherd. Her coat was dusted white, her body a dark flame against the snow. Behind her came Daisy and Max, smaller silhouettes but steady, ears up, eyes bright like little lanterns. Miles's heart lurched. He hadn't expected them to follow. The mother approached within a few feet and stopped, head tilted slightly, as if assessing the damage. She didn't whine. She didn't panic. She stared at Miles with a fierce concentration that felt almost human. Then she moved. She began circling him, paws carving wide loops into the snow, over and over, stamping the ground into a pattern. She ran a short distance, returned, circled again, then sprinted away and came back, circling tighter, more insistent, as if drawing a target around him for the world to see. Miles blinked, confused through pain. Then, understanding punched through the fog. She couldn't drag him. She couldn't call anyone in words. But she could make a sign so strange that any person with eyes would stop and wonder. The mother shepherd barked once, sharp and commanding, then bolted into the trees. Daisy and Max hesitated, looking back at Miles, then followed her like tiny shadows. Miles sat alone again, the circles around him darkened by paw prints. Minutes stretched. The cold chewed at his fingers. His thoughts began to blur into syrupy fragments, and the storm made everything feel unreal, like he was already becoming part of the landscape. Then, faint at first, a mechanical hum grew in the distance. Engines. A shout, muffled by wind. Flashlights sliced through snow. "Tracks!" a voice called, Over here! Look at this! Two figures pushed through the trees. One was a ranger, broad and middle-aged, with a square face reddened by cold and a beard flecked with ice. His name patch read Clayton, and his movements were brisk, practiced, the kind of man who'd carried bodies before. The other was a younger volunteer, a woman in her late 20s, with dark hair tucked under a beanie, cheeks wind-burned, eyes sharp with concern. She moved fast, but careful, as if empathy had trained her as much as any manual. "Sir, can you hear me?" she shouted, kneeling. The ranger crouched beside Miles, hands already checking pulse, checking pupils, the basics of life. "We almost missed you," Clayton said, breath coming out in hard clouds. "Some hikers saw something weird on the ridge earlier, animal tracks making circles like a marker. They called it in." The woman wrapped a thermal blanket around Miles, and warmth, artificial and blessed, began to fight the cold. Miles's eyes drifted toward the tree line. For a moment, he thought he saw the mother shepherd standing there, still as a vow, watching. Then the snow shifted, and she was gone, melted back into the myth of the woods. As they lifted Miles onto the sled, he heard Clayton speak again, lower now, grim. "By the way," the ranger added, "we're also tracking a crew setting illegal traps. Might be using poison. If you saw anything, you'll want to tell us." Miles tried to speak. His tongue felt thick, but inside him, something burned awake through the pain. If those men were poisoning the mountain, they weren't just a threat to wildlife. They were a threat to the dogs in his cabin, to Teddy, to the mother, and to the fragile truce he'd started to believe in. The first thing Miles Harris learned about healing was that it didn't arrive like a parade. It arrived like weather, quietly, in increments you only noticed when you looked back. Weeks passed in the small clinic down in town, where the air smelled of disinfectant and burnt coffee, and the walls were the color of surrender. Miles lay with his ankle immobilized in a hard white brace, the bone set clean, but the pain lingering like a stubborn memory. He hated being still. Stillness gave his mind room to replay Ethan Price's last moments, to rerun the tape and search for the version where Miles was faster, smarter, luckier. Yet something else played alongside that grief now. The mother shepherd's eyes in the snow, the circles she carved, the impossible logic of an animal choosing mercy. Ranger Clayton visited twice, bringing updates in a practical tone that didn't pretend feelings were useful. Clayton was the kind of man built from square angles and responsibility, his beard trimmed close, his gaze steady, and his hands always a little rough, as if paperwork and wilderness both demanded calluses. "We found more traps near the creek," he said the first time, voice low. "And yeah, looks like poison bait. We're setting up a quiet operation. No hero stuff." Miles gave a humorless smile. "Not my style anymore," he lied. On the third visit, Clayton brought someone else, the young volunteer from the rescue, now introduced properly as Emma Brooks. Emma was late 20s, athletic in a functional way rather than a showy one, with olive-toned skin, wind-burned at the cheeks, dark hair usually pulled into a messy braid, and eyes that didn't flinch when looking at pain. She spoke gently, but directly, like a person who'd learned that kindness without honesty was just decoration. "Your dogs are safe," she told Miles. "We got to your cabin. Teddy was rough, but he's improving. The mother wouldn't come close to us, but she stayed nearby, watching." Miles felt his throat tighten around a sound that wasn't words. Safe. The word landed in him like a warm stone. When the doctor finally cleared him to leave, Miles refused the offer of crutches longer than necessary. He took them anyway, because stubbornness was not strength, and he was learning, late but sincerely, that refusing help wasn't a virtue. Clayton drove him back up the mountain in a ranger truck that smelled of damp wool and pine needles. The road was still lined with snowbanks like frozen waves. Miles kept his gaze forward, jaw clenched, bracing for disappointment the way he'd braced for bad news for years. But when they reached the cabin, the porch told a different story. 3 small paw prints were pressed into the thin crust of snow at the threshold, close together, as if the puppies had stood there in formation. Beside them lay a short stick placed neatly, almost ceremonially, like an offering made by creatures who didn't understand gifts but understood intention. Miles stepped down slowly, pain sparking in his ankle, and stared until his vision blurred. He wasn't a religious man, not in the traditional sense. Still, the sight felt like a blessing left by clumsy, loving hands. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and life. Daisy barreled toward him first, bigger now, legs too long for her coordination, ears half up, tail wagging so hard her whole body swayed. She looked like Joy trying on a new body. Max came second, sturdier, more confident, his muzzle darker, his eyes bright with the audacity of someone convinced he'd survived because he deserved to. He barked once, sharp and proud, then sneezed as if embarrassed by his own emotion. Teddy was last, slower but upright, his coat still slightly thinner than the others, yet his eyes were clear and shining, and when he reached Miles, he pressed his forehead gently into Miles's shin, a quiet contact that felt like forgiveness. Miles crouched with a hiss of pain and laughed, a low, rough sound that startled him with its sincerity. "All right," he whispered, voice cracking. "You win." Clayton didn't come inside. He stood on the porch, gaze scanning the tree line, always half working. "Operation's still on," he said. "Those guys didn't just set traps. They circled your cabin, too. Might be looking for the dogs, or for something else. That collar you found? That's a clue." Miles nodded, and the old part of him that once ran toward danger lifted its head, but this time it wasn't hungry for violence. It was hungry for rightness. A few days later, Miles insisted on helping. Clayton resisted until Emma gave him a look that suggested she'd already judged the situation and the argument was over. "He can observe," she said. "He can document, not charge in." Miles promised, and for once he meant it. They moved at dusk, 3 figures stitched into the edge of the woods, Clayton in his ranger gear, sturdy and methodical, Emma in layered winter clothing, compact and quick, carrying a camera and evidence bags, Miles with a limp and a pack, his movements quieter than his injury should allow. They watched the creek from a ridge. The poachers arrived like rot. 3 men, the same silhouettes Miles had seen through binoculars. Up close, the tallest had a blunt face and a beard that looked like it grew out of spite. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. The jittery one kept scratching his neck and glancing around, eyes darting like a trapped animal. The third, lean and older, wore a cheap camouflage jacket and a smirk that suggested he enjoyed cruelty for sport, not profit. Miles didn't rush them. He watched, recorded, noted license plates, photographed the poison bait, the traps, the tools. Emma's hands were steady as she captured evidence, her breathing calm, her focus sharp. Clayton signaled on his radio, voice low, and within minutes, more rangers approached from the opposite side, closing the net. The confrontation was brief, ugly, and surprisingly quiet. No cinematic fistfights, just the click of handcuffs, the rustle of jackets, the muttered curses of men realizing the world had finally noticed them. When the lead poacher tried to bolt, he slipped on ice and went down hard, and Miles felt an old, dangerous satisfaction flare. He exhaled and let it pass. This wasn't about punishment. It was about stopping the harm. They removed the traps. They collected the poison. The creek, freed from human malice, ran on, dark and relentless, as if washing its own wounds. Late summer arrived with a softer kind of gold, the kind that made the world look forgiven. Miles sat on his porch one evening, his ankle aching but stable. 3 adolescent shepherds sprawled around him like living blankets. Daisy's coat had grown sleek, her eyes still gentle. Max's chest broadened, his posture bold, as if he'd appointed himself guardian of the cabin. Teddy, smaller but resilient, lay with his head on Miles's boot, breathing slow and even. The woods beyond the clearing held its usual secrets, and then one of those secrets stepped into view. The mother shepherd appeared at the tree line, healthier now, ribs less visible, coat glossy in the amber light. She stood still, watching, her tail low but calm. Miles didn't move toward her. He understood something he'd spent years misunderstanding. Love was not possession. It was respect, given room to breathe. The mother took one step forward, then another, careful, measuring the world for betrayal. When she reached the edge of the porch, she paused. Her eyes met Miles's, and in that look he felt the full circle close. He had opened a door in a storm. She had drawn circles in the snow to keep him alive. Now they stood in peace, debt repaid in a language older than words. She leaned in and touched her nose to Miles's hand, a brief, feather-light contact, then withdrew, turning back toward the forest. Daisy stood and watched her go, tail wagging slowly like a question. Max whined once, conflicted, torn between wild blood and warm fire. Teddy simply looked from the trees to Miles, and in that gaze was a choice being made. The mother paused at the tree line and looked back one last time, not pleading, not commanding, just acknowledging. Then she disappeared into the green shadows as if she'd always belonged there. Miles sat very still. His chest tightened with an emotion he couldn't name, so he gave it the only name that mattered. "Thank you," he said, barely above breath. The 3 dogs leaned into him, warm and alive, and Miles let himself believe a new truth. He wasn't a man who had failed and then fled. He was a man who had stayed long enough to be chosen again. Sometimes God doesn't send a miracle with thunder and trumpets. Sometimes he sends it on 4 paws, in a circle drawn quietly in the snow, in a second chance you didn't earn but were brave enough to accept. Miles thought he was done being useful, done being chosen, done believing anything good could still find him. Yet the Lord used a frightened mother dog and 3 fragile puppies to crack open a locked heart and remind him of a simple truth. When you open your door to save a life, God can open a door in you too. In everyday life, we don't usually face blizzards on a mountain, but we all face cold seasons, the kind where we feel alone, guilty, tired, or afraid. And in those moments, the smallest act of compassion can become a holy turning point, because God loves to work through ordinary hands, ordinary homes, and ordinary decisions that say, "Not today, not on my watch." If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope, and drop a comment below. Have you ever seen a small miracle show up in an unexpected way? And if you believe kindness still matters, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for more stories that warm the soul. May God bless you, protect your home, strengthen your heart, and guide your steps, today and always. Amen.